The finale of season 21 of Doctor Who, The Twin Dilemma, is widely regarded as one of the show's lowest points, a chaotic and controversial introduction for the Sixth Doctor that to this day is often cited amongst the series' weakest stories. Naturally, moving into season 22, the production team had a clear opportunity to recover from the misstep and firmly establish this new incarnation of the Doctor. The season opener needed to reassure viewers, deliver a strong, confident story filled with familiar elements that captured what made Doctor Who work at its best. That story was Attack of the Cybermen, a serial in many ways embodies both the strengths and the flaws of this era of the show. So let's take a closer look and ask, was this Doctor Who story a big missed opportunity? From the off, the Sixth Doctor was designed to be a marked departure from his predecessor. This wasn't a new approach for Doctor Who, as each regeneration traditionally redefined the character. However, this incarnation initially leaned into a more abrasive personality, brash, egotistical, volatile, and unpredictable, while still unmistakably the Doctor. These traits were pushed to the extremes in his debut, The Twin Dilemma, where the character's instability was so heightened that it became for many viewers difficult to warm to. While this could be attributed to a post-regeneration trauma, season 22 still needed to steer the Doctor into more balanced and accessible portrayal, without losing the core edge. Attack of the Cybermen begins to address this immediately. In the opening scenes, the Doctor is seen working on the TARDIS's chameleon circuit, energetic and focused, before briefly snapping at Peri when she questions his stability. Crucially, however, this moment does not escalate into the aggression seen previously. Instead, it quickly resolves, with the Doctor regaining control and continuing his work. This maintains the unpredictability of the character, but tempers it into something more controlled. Whenever a new Doctor is introduced, the return of a familiar adversary often serves as both reassurance and testing ground. Previous incarnations had each faced iconic enemies early in their tenure, and season 22 would continue this tradition. The Cybermen were chosen to fulfill this role following their resurgence in Earthshock and their appearance in The Five Doctors. Alongside them, the return of Lytton, first introduced in Resurrection of the Daleks, reinforced the story's connection to recent continuity, while expanding his character into a more central role. Beyond Attack of the Cybermen itself, season 22 continued this reliance on returning foes, including the Master, Centaurans, the Daleks, and Davros, alongside the introduction of new antagonists as well. The intention was clear, to ground the Sixth Doctor in familiarity while reinforcing the show's long-established history and continuity. Season 22 also marked a significant structural change, shifting from the traditional 25-minute four-part episodes to two 45-minute episodes. While this reduced the impact of the well-known cliffhangers, it placed greater emphasis on character development, with episode 1 typically establishing tone and personality, and episode 2 resolving the narrative. However, whilst this format benefited characterization, it came with potential consequences for narrative pacing and clarity. One of the earliest and most notable effects of this tonal and structural shift is the way violence is presented within the story. The Cybermen, in particular, are depicted in a more immediate and forceful manner than in previous appearances, with confrontations carrying a sharper edge and a greater sense of physical threat. Rather than the slow-building menace of earlier Cybermen stories, the violence here feels more direct and abrupt, contributing to a harsher overall atmosphere. This reflects the wider change in Season 22's storytelling approach that had been hinted at during Season 21, where tension is often delivered through intensity rather than gradual escalation. As the season continues, this increased emphasis on confrontation and aggression becomes more pronounced, shaping not just individual stories, but the overall identity of this era of the programme. So now we've established how Attack of the Cybermen sets a broader template for Season 22. What is the story actually trying to achieve? At its core, the serial opens with the Sixth Doctor, already busying himself on board the TARDIS, attempting repairs to the chameleon circuit, when a distress signal draws the TARDIS down to present-day London. There, the Doctor and Peri find themselves pulled into a situation that quickly becomes entangled with a returning figure from the show's recent past, Lytton. Stranded on Earth after the events of Resurrection and Daleks, Lytton has assembled a criminal gang under the guise of a planned bank robbery. However, this is merely a cover for something far more complex, a covert operation that soon draws both him and his accomplices into direct contact with the Cybermen. Before long, the Doctor, Perry, Lytton, and the remnants of his gang are all taken prisoner and transported to Telos, where the Cyber Controller has survived. Here, the Cybermen attempt to manipulate time itself in order to alter their own history, seeking to prevent the destruction of Mondas, even if it means erasing Telos and its native Cryons in the process. Episode 1, without question, is one of the strongest examples of atmosphere in this era of Doctor Who. The story opens in the sewers of London with the brutal, unseen killing of 2 inspection workers, an immediate signal that something dangerous is lurking beneath the surface. From here, the sewers become the dominant visual and tonal space for the episode. Dark, oppressive, and claustrophobic. The Cybermen are not yet fully seen, but constantly implied, a presence rather than an appearance. And this is where the story briefly touches on one of the Cybermen's most unsettling ideas, the idea of conversion. Whilst often referenced in earlier stories, the process of transforming humans into Cybermen is shown more explicitly here, with the sewers functioning as almost an industrial processing site. The implication is clear. Those taken in are not simply killed, but repurposed. Even Lytton's associates, the policemen, meet this fate and reinforce the Cybermen's efficiency and brutality. And these ideas connect back to earlier depictions of the Cybermen as predators operating in the shadows, from the 10th planet to the invasion, the moon base, and into modern appearances such as Earthshock, always emerging from darkness, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Episode 1 then successfully uses this legacy while establishing new characters. The Sixth Doctor in a more controlled state, Lytton as a morally ambiguous figure, and the Cybermen as an organised and present threat. The 45-minute format allows for slower establishment, even if that means some earlier characters are quickly removed from the narrative. But where Episode 1 builds the atmosphere, Episode 2 seemingly dismantles it. The action then shifts from Earth to Telos, reintroducing the Cyber Controller and expanding the mythology further to include the Cryons, the fate of Mondas, and a complex plan involving time travel and Earth's destruction via Halley's Comet. At the same time, multiple narrative threads begin competing for attention. The Doctor's escape and confrontation with the Cybermen, Perry's separation and movement through the tombs, and Lytton's shifting allegiances and eventual fate. Rather than continuing the focused tension of Episode 1, the story becomes structurally fragmented. Characters spend much of the runtime moving between locations, while exposition rapidly fills in the gaps between plot threads. The result is a narrative that feels more concerned with resolving ideas than developing momentum. There are still those moments of brutality and tension, most notably Lytton's torture and partial conversion into a Cyberman, and the darker tone is not entirely lost. However, the oppressive atmosphere of the opening episode is significantly diluted by the weight of its own plotting, and that is really the defining issue of Attack of the Cybermen. Episode 1 is atmospheric, restrained, and deliberately paced, a story about what is lurking beneath the surface. Episode 2, by contrast, becomes a race to resolve an expanding set of ideas, many of which come from different corners of Doctor Who mythology. The result is a story that feels split between intention and execution, one half focused on mood and tension, the other on explanation and continuity. When John Nathan Turner took over as producer of Doctor Who in 1980, one of his defining priorities was the show's own history. This often manifested through returning monsters, recurring characters, and direct continuations of older plot threads, a tendency perhaps most clearly demonstrated in the Five Doctors, where nostalgia was the clear purpose. However, beyond anniversary events, this approach also shaped regular storytelling. The Master's evolution from his decayed form as first seen into the Deadly Assassin, into his new form in the Keeper of Traken and beyond. The outcome of the Daleks' and Mabellan's war, introducing Destiny in the Daleks, served as an outcome and purpose of resurrection of the Daleks, and Davros's continuing presence all demonstrated a growing reliance on the past as narrative fuel. Attack of the Cybermen continues this pattern, bringing them back in a more brutal new era following from Earthshock, whilst also reconnecting to their earlier 1960s portrayals. On paper, this approach is not inherently a weakness. In fact, the central premise, the Cybermen using time travel to alter history and prevent the destruction of Mondas, is a strong one, fully worthy of carrying a Doctor Who story. The problem is not the idea itself, but what surrounds it. Attack of the Cybermen then becomes a convergence point for multiple continuity threads. The return of the Cyber Controller from Tomb of the Cybermen, references to Mondas from the 10th planet, elements of Earth-based Cybermen activity reminiscent of the invasion, and even callbacks to the Doctor's earlier history at Totter's Lane from an unearthly child. Individually, these references are effective. Together, though, they begin to compete for space within the narrative. This sense of overload is often linked to the story's authorship, credited on screen to Paula Moore, a pseudonym whose true origins remain debated. One interpretation suggests script editor Eric Saywood as the primary creative force, potentially working through indirect commissioning methods, with additional contributions from others such as Ian Levine, whose well-known enthusiasm for Doctor Who's continuity is widely acknowledged. Saywood's influence can be seen in the tone and structure, the bleak atmosphere, high body count, mercenary characters, and the thematic continuation of ideas explored in stories such as Earthshock and Resurrection of the Daleks. The return of production collaborators such as director Matthew Robinson, who worked on Resurrection of the Daleks, and composer Malcolm Clarke, who worked on both Earthshock and Resurrection of the Daleks, further reinforces this continuity of a dark tone. At the same time, the story's dense layering of historical references and continuity connections reflects a different creative impulse, one driven by a desire to integrate as much of Doctor Who's past as possible into a single narrative framework, and that could be attributed to Ian Levine. The issue is not that either approach is invalid. In fact, both instincts, Saywood's dark and more violent tone and Levine's continuity-heavy history-driven structure, are individually understandable within the context of Season 22. The problem arises when they are combined within a single serial. The result is a story where its strongest concept, the Cybermen's attempt to rewrite their own history, repeatedly takes a backseat to the demands of tying together multiple legacy threads. The subplots involving Lytton, the Cryons, Telos, and Cyberman continuity all compete for narrative attention, diluting the focus of the central premise. Whilst the core Cyberman time travel plot remains compelling, it is frequently interrupted by the need to resolve or revisit other elements. Instead of a streamlined narrative, the story becomes a layering of ideas, each individually interesting, but collectively overwhelming. And this is where Attack of the Cybermen begins to lose narrative clarity. The second episode, in particular, shifts rapidly between objectives, attempting to conclude multiple arcs simultaneously, which further exposes the structural weight of everything the story is carrying. This is not a failure of imagination, if anything, it's the opposite. A story with too many imaginative directions competing for that dominance. Ultimately, what holds Attack of the Cybermen back is not a lack of strong ideas, but an excess of them. There is a strong Cyberman story buried within the structure, one focused, coherent narrative about time, survival, and rewriting history. However, that core is repeatedly displaced by the weight of continuity, returning characters, and competing creative visions. The result is a story that isn't actually quite bad, but rarely fully focused, and that imbalance is what prevents it becoming a definitive Cyberman story that it's clearly aiming to be. Which ultimately raises the question, was this simply ambition without restraint, or a case of too many good ideas competing in the same space? At the end of the day, Attack of the Cybermen is not actually a bad story. Rather, it is a story trying to satisfy too many ambitions at once. Establishing the Sixth Doctor, experimenting with a new production format, continuing long-running continuity threads, and reinventing the Cybermen for a darker era of the programme. Ironically, the core premise is actually strong enough on its own. A focused narrative centred entirely around the Cybermen attempting to rewrite history and prevent the destruction of Mondas could have made for a far tighter and more effective story. Keeping the action largely earthbound may have also preserved the oppressive atmosphere established in Episode 1, while allowing more time for the Cybermen's plan to unfold naturally rather than simply being explained through exposition. Instead, the story's many competing ideas begin to suffocate both the narrative and several of its characters. The Cyber Controller, despite the novelty of actor Michael Kilgareth returning for the role nearly 2 decades after Two of the Cybermen, contributes surprisingly little to the overall story. Also, supporting characters such as Bates, Stratton, Griffiths, and Russell often feel underdeveloped or unnecessary, frequently becoming casualties of the overcrowded narrative rather than meaningful additions to it. Cryons perhaps suffer most from this problem. Conceptually, the idea of Telos having an oppressed native population is interesting, but the execution struggles to generate emotional investment. Their visual design, vocal performances, and inconsistent motivations make them difficult to fully sympathise with, despite their understandable opposition to the Cybermen. Even their alliance with Lytton raises questions, particularly when they place greater trust in the mercenary than the Doctor himself. By contrast, Lytton emerges as one of the story's strongest elements. Expanded significantly from his appearance in Resurrection of the Daleks, he becomes a morally ambiguous figure who not only deceives the Cybermen, but also the Doctor and his own associates. His eventual sacrifice gives the story a surprisingly emotional core, and his death carries more impact than many of the story's supposed heroic figures. Despite its flaws, Attack of the Cybermen is hugely important in establishing the tone and identity of Season 22. The story acts as a blueprint for much of what follows. The emphasis on body horror and violent imagery, the experimental 45-minute structure, the increased focus on continuity and returning adversaries, and the gradual refinement of the Sixth Doctor himself. Season 22 would continue pushing these ideas further. Vengeance on Varos explores televised violence and public desensitization. The Mark of the Rani centers around scientific manipulations of the human mind. The Two Doctors leans heavily into genetic experimentation and more body horror. Time Lash delivers mutations, and Revelation of the Daleks arguably perfects many of the darker themes this story first experiments with, where Davros is able to convert humans into Daleks. At the centre of all this is the Sixth Doctor himself. While still arrogant and volatile, Colin Baker delivers a noticeably more controlled and compassionate interpretation than in the Twin Dilemma. The foundations of a far stronger Doctor are already visible here, even if the surrounding material does not always support him. In many ways, Attack of the Cybermen feels like the start of a season finding its identity in real time. Some of this experimentation works, some of it clearly doesn't. By the time Season 22 reached its conclusion with Revelation of the Daleks, many of these ideas, the format, the tone, and the Sixth Doctor's personality, feel significantly more refined. However, before the production team could fully develop this direction, the series was placed on hiatus by Michael Grade, and when the show eventually returned, much of the Season 22 format had been abandoned. So, was Attack of the Cybermen a big missed opportunity then? In some ways, yes. Not because the story lacks ambition, but because it lacks restraint. There is that great Cyberman story hidden within it, one built around atmosphere, desperation, and the terrifying idea of the Cybermen rewriting history itself. But that story is repeatedly buried beneath continuity callbacks, overcrowded plotting, and too many competing narrative ideas. And yet, despite all that, the story still matters. Because while it may not have fully redeemed the Sixth Doctor overnight, it began the process of redefining him. Over time, this idea of Doctor Who has undergone significant re-evaluation, with many now appreciating the ambition and experimentation that once divided the audience. Attack of the Cybermen may never have been capable of single-handedly restoring the show's reputation after the Twin Dilemma, but with a more focused narrative, it could perhaps have come far closer than it ultimately did. But what do you think? Was Attack of the Cybermen a missed opportunity in establishing the Sixth Doctor? Is it an overlooked gem of a story amidst the chaos of the Sixth Doctor era? Or is it just plain rubbish? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. But the moment has been prepared for.